I'd also like to talk about a case of forced separation. An example of this would be the Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants began to arrive in the 1850s, but were discriminated against almost immediately. By the 1870s, they had very large, um, severe restrictions against them. They're the only ethnic group ever to have specifically been denied entrance to the country. And then they had no civil rights here. So, as you can see here, they were prohibited by law to testify in court, to own property, to vote, to have their families join them, to marry non Chinese people, to work at particular jobs, to live in particular areas. They were quite constrained and restricted in terms of their liberties. The only way that Chinese immigrants could survive well was to separate from the mainstream. And this led to the creation of Chinatowns. There used to be many, many, many Chinatowns across the US. The most famous one is the one in San Francisco that is still there, although New York also has a large Chinatown, and there are others. But these Chinatowns made survival possible by providing political and social support systems for newcomers. They also organized the basic needs of the community. So, if there were particular foods that needed to be gotten, they could get that for everybody in the community, for example. And they represented a political voice for the Chinese in trying to counter discriminatory legislation. Here's a picture of the original Chinatown in San Francisco. It was simply an area that was designated as the place where the Chinese would live. The Chinese moved in to the typical buildings that were there anyway, but then added decorations that made them feel more at home. It was 12 blocks, and there were businesses, there were temples, family associations. Rooming houses were particularly important because the ratio of men to women was 20 to 1 in 1880. And there were opening opium dens, gambling halls. There were all sorts of things that the community needed. The atmosphere was good. You could hear Chinese. You could see examples of Chinese culture. You could see Chinese writing, costumes. You could see traditions being continued. And it was a place where the Chinese felt some safety. Outside of Chinatown, however, the Chinese faced racial and economic oppression. And then came 1906. In 1906, as we know, there was a huge earthquake in San Francisco, and this is Chinatown after 1906. So Chinatown was completely destroyed. And the question was, what do we do with these Chinese people? Originally, when the Chinese had been given this land, it had been land that nobody wanted, but it became very valuable land. And so there had been a movement before the earthquake to remove the Chinese from Chinatown and move them somewhere further away so that that land could be developed into private homes for the dominant mainstream population of white Californians. So by 1905, you see this headline: San Francisco may be freed from the standing menace of Chinatown. Or over to the right, the Oakland Inquirer has said the cities in the immediate vicinity of San Francisco Bay never had in the past such an opportunity as now to do away with the huddling together of Chinese in districts where it is undesirable. from the standpoint of civilization to permit the lower and vicious classes of Orientals to congregate. This has little recognition of the fact that the Chinese were forced to go to that place. And then moves on that the opportunity should be promptly received to move these people out of the Chinatown as it was then. In order to be able to keep their homes and where they lived, Chinatown needed to be rebuilt very quickly. And so in order to counter that negative of the stereotype of a crowded and dirty Chinatown, a group of Chinese merchants got together and planned what came to be the Chinatown that we see today. And before other people could come in to take over their land, they started to rebuild Chinatown, but in a form which we called Oriental. This was not Chinese. It was a city that was intended, that was romanticized and whimsical. It used Chinese motifs and colors and decorative elements, but it was supposed to be a new Orientalized Chinatown and primarily a tourist attraction. So, in order to rebuild, the Chinese immigrants had to give up the Chinese-ness of their area where they were living and instead appeal to tourists by creating what you see in this picture, which is the Oriental idea of a Chinese space. It was a wonderland for tourists in search of the exotic. It was not a Chinese space. So it was the only way that this Oriental community could survive. But in order to do so, it had to give up its Chinese identity. And today, Chinatown is one of San Francisco's biggest attractions. But by having to do this to allow themselves to be taken from their own culture and instead take on this exotic Oriental culture, this helped to continue the discrimination against Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans, as we know in 2020, has even led to a fear of this group based on the coronavirus, that for some reason, people whose ancestors have been here since 1850 are in some way responsible for the coronavirus. It is acceptable still for a president of the United States to call the coronavirus the China flu or the Kung flu, and to deny that these terms have any effect on the Asian Americans in the United States. And this use of his designation for COVID-19 has simply amplified the connection of Chinese Americans with COVID-19. And it has made Chinese Americans continue to be seen as different from the rest of the United States. Not only are Asian Americans treated differently because of racism, but also because we then assume that they are also recent immigrants and that as recent immigrants, they have brought COVID-19 with them. So we have a deadly pandemic, we have presumed immigration status, and we have racism, all three coming together and leading to many, many instances of violence against Chinese Americans and other Asian American groups. There is, for example, the CBS White House correspondent, Weijia Jiang, who came here from China when she was 2 years old. In March, she tweeted that a White House official had called the virus Kung flu to her face, which she said makes me wonder what they're calling it behind my back. And in response, a conservative radio host wrote, "I don't care that you are offended by Kung flu or Wuhan virus or Chinese virus. I don't care that you were offended. Instead, he told her that he was sorry that she was sensitive and eager to embrace Chinese communist propaganda. So somebody was using a term that was racist, and she was told not to be so sensitive. How does an Asian American react when somebody basically says to them, "You are not an American"? Andrew Yang, you remember that he was a candidate for president in the Democratic primaries in 2019. He highlighted that the most common reaction by Asian Americans to somebody saying something to them should be to embrace and show our Americanness in ways we never have before. So when somebody says, "You're not a real American," prove that you are. And that kind of response shows, of course, that we want to defend ourselves and we want to demonstrate that we belong. But how do you counter somebody who says that you are not a real American? How do you prove it? By having to prove that you are an American, you make the situation worse. Since research has shown that when people who are from a diverse background are forced to prove that they are American, this further restricts what's considered to be American. So let's look at this research. There were two separate studies which included groups of Asian American and white American students who were given a task. So in the first study, they were, when they went into the interview room, they were first asked whether they spoke English. This was asked of them to call into question whether these students were immigrants or not. After that question was asked, all of the students were asked to write down their names, the names of 1980s TV shows that they could remember. And that is because 1980s TV shows is cultural knowledge that Americans would know, but that immigrants might not. In the other experiment, when the students went into the interview, half of that group was told that they could only participate if they were American. After their immigration status was then questioned, they were asked to choose items from a menu. So what they found out in both of those situations was, in the first experiment, the Asian American students spent much more time listing shows as a sign that they possess this kind of cultural knowledge. So they spent much more time than the white American students because it was important for them to prove that they had extraordinary knowledge about 1980s TV shows, because that shows that you are American. And in the second experiment, Asian American students were more likely to choose hamburgers or hot dogs, although they were not told they had to choose anything specific from the menu. But the other students chose whatever one wanted from a menu, such as a chicken sandwich or a salad. But Asian American students chose hamburgers and hot dogs, which are considered stereotypical American foods. So in both of these experiments, the answers that they chose to prove their Americanness narrowed what it means to be called an American quite significantly. They chose those things that were most American and let go those things that could not be so strongly emphasized as American. So choosing the chicken sandwich or the salad was not Americanness, was not American. By doing this, you limit what can be chosen to be American. So if everybody that you question the Americanness of chooses a hamburger or a hot dog to prove their Americanness, then you come to expect hamburgers and hot dogs to be chosen by those people who are American, whether they like hamburgers or hot dogs, right? and whether that's any more American than that chicken sandwich I've been talking about. So it narrows what you're even allowed to do to prove that you are an American. So that was two examples of forced acculturation. And this forced acculturation has long legacy, particularly when there are cases of racism, as there were in both of these groups. These immigrant groups were denied equal status. They would never be given equal status, no matter how hard they tried, and would have to ask permission again and again and again. And there is no way that an immigrant group can successfully integrate when faced with racism and assumed immigrant status. So that's an introduction to how acculturation works. Next week, we're going to be looking at immigrants currently in the US, and particularly at immigrants of Latinx background. Thank you.